Hello.
Hello.
In this video, we're going to do a sampling of what the churches have said in their commentaries about Revelation 14:20. I will reread the verse. 14:20, Revelation. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and blood came out of the winepress, as high up as the bridles of the horses, for a distance of 1,600 furlongs. So for our first sampling, I'm going to read from this commentary. The Revelation of St. John the Divine by George B. Caird. This book, this commentary was recommended to me after hearing a sermon by Victor Shepherd, who was our former pastor. He came to visit the congregation later, and he gave a sermon on Revelation. And I went up to him afterwards, because for the first time, Revelation had some meaning to me after his sermon. So I asked him to recommend a commentary. This was the one he recommended.
By the way, Victor Shepherd is not only our former pastor in Mississauga, Ontario, Canada, but also one of the foremost theologians in Canada. Indeed, he's on the list of the greatest Wesleyan and Calvinist scholars on the planet today. Mm-hmm. So if you can get any of Victor's works.
Mm-hmm. We had arranged for him to do a series on church history. So he's a church historian, like he's an expert on church history.
Expert on church history and the history of ideas in the church. So I also wanted to say about Caird, the reason Caird is more than just a favorite Revelation commentator. By the way, he also did one on Luke, which I profited from. Mm-hmm. But Caird is the principal influence, one of the principal influences on Tom Wright, who some of you will have heard of, maybe the most famous New Testament commentator on the planet today. So Caird has had a vast influence on how people approach Revelation, the New Testament as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So this is what he has to say about that verse, or at least part of it. 1600 is a square number, but one which has no obvious prototype in the Old Testament. If we set any store by numerology, it provides some slight confirmation for the interpretation of the vintage as a great martyrdom. For the only other square numbers in the book are the 144,000 of the army of the Lord, which is basically 12 times 12, and the dimensions of the holy city. That's all he says.
That's all he says. He's not willing to go out on a limb as to the specifics. The only thing he wants to dwell upon is the symbolic value of the number 1600. How many of us would even think of that? Mm-hmm. And we'll talk about that a bit more with the other commentators. Mm-hmm. I thought a good counterweight to that would be George Eldon Ladd, who is also a very, very famous commentator. Caird put that one out in 1966. This one came along in 1972. And Ladd is premillennial, whereas Caird, I'm not sure about this, but I would think he would be amillennial, meaning does not believe in the millennium as a literal 1,000 period in the future.
Okay.
So that's been the majority position in recent decades, the amillennial position. But lately, in the last generation, since around 1970, the dispensational premillennial position has come forward. Now, Ladd is not dispensational, but he is premillennial, as we talked about in the prior video about the various methods of interpretation. It's your starting point. So Ladd is premillennial, and in his commentary he has a little bit more detail than Caird does about how he thinks this prophecy should be interpreted.
Okay, so I will read what we've marked off here. All right, for verse 20. The winepress was trodden outside the city, which is not identified and probably is not meant to be identified specifically. The city is here the symbol of God's dwelling in the midst of his people, possibly the New Jerusalem. And the thought is that judgment will fall upon the wicked as they are shut out from the presence of God. Possibly there is a vague allusion to the eschatological battle of Joel chapter 3, verses 2 and 12. The metaphor suddenly changes from the treading of grapes to a military slaughter. The flow of blood is incredible, literally conceived. 1,600 stadia is the distance of about 184 miles, the entire length of Palestine. The entire land is pictured as being inundated in blood to a depth of about 4 feet. The thought is clear. A radical judgment that crushes every vestige of evil and hostility to the reign of God.
So although Ladd tends to want to interpret most of this symbolically, about the city, etc., he admits that it has some reference to parallels in Joel, and we'll get to that more in the next segment. What's the Joel vision about? This judgment that God is going to judge in a place called the Valley of Jehoshaphat in Joel. Yeah. And this is an allusion to it, as also Isaiah 63, which we'll also talk about more. But in even the reference to the measure, the 1,600 furlongs, having some reference to the length of the promised land, you can see Ladd is seeing the connections that most of us wouldn't make.
But you know what I liked? And what I just noticed is he uses the word possibly at least twice here.
Yes.
So he's not dogmatic. He's cautious. You know, and when you're approaching something like this, you should be cautious. You shouldn't be dogmatic if it's not dogmatic. I think he says, it doesn't say, but possibly it's the New Jerusalem. You know, this
you
is a
can
good
see
way.
You can see how he leans, but he's not going to be dogmatic. And I think that's one thing I've learned about the great commentators. They're the greater they are, the less dogmatic they tend to be.
Yeah,
which is
humility
refreshing.
Yeah, there's a humility there.
Now between this one by Ladd and this one by Mounce,
just so you can look at them.
this one by Mounce came out in 1977, this one in 72. And in the meantime, something had happened in Christendom. A book had been published called The Late Great Planet Earth. And as reticent as Ladd and Caird and a lot of other commentators were before about what this thing might mean, I think after 1975 and The Late Great Planet Earth by Al Lindsay, people tended to want to say more, because there was more to say in rebuttal to some of the very dogmatic positions that Al Lindsay was taking in this book, which, by the way, sold something like 25 million copies in the first few years of its publication, which is unprecedented for a book about the future in those days. What was it?
Was it competing with the Truth Book? Because I always heard that got...
The Truth Book sold something like 100 million copies, but of course they were distributed at a quarter apiece, door to door across the planet in multiple languages. Al Lindsay's book apparently sold 25 million copies. I don't know if that's beyond its English pressing. But when Mounce is dealing with the same passage in Revelation 14 verse 20, he says this: "The city outside of which the winepress was trodden is probably Jerusalem. The judgment of the nations in Joel 3:12-14, which supplies the dual figures of harvest and vintage, takes place in the Valley of Jehoshaphat, which tradition links with the Kidron Valley, lying between Jerusalem and the Mount of Olives. Zechariah 14 verses 1-4 places the final battle on the outskirts of Jerusalem." So he's willing to go further with the location. What does he do with the rest? Well, he says, Enoch 53 verse 1, here he goes outside the canon to what we call the Apocrypha or Pseudepigrapha. Enoch 53:1, which was a very popular book back in the day when Revelation was written, speaks of judgment in a deep valley near the Valley of Hinnom. So he links the Valley of Hinnom, which Jehovah's Witnesses know has something to do with Gehenna, with this Valley of Jehoshaphat. Judgment outside the city must certainly be an allusion to the one who suffered for the sins of man outside the gate, Hebrews 13 verse 12. So he's making a comparison with Jesus suffering death, martyrdom outside the gate. Now something else is happening outside the gate. And of course, in the first case, it's literal. Those who refuse the first judgment must take part in the second. The judgment upon Christ, in other words, if we take that, we accept that for the worth God puts upon it, we will avoid this judgment. And then he talks about the distance itself. 1,600 furlongs, some 184 miles, has been variously interpreted. Geographically, it is the approximate length of Palestine. Symbolically, it squares the number 4, which is the number of the earth, you might remember in the Bible. For instance, 4 corners of the earth, 4 winds of the earth, and multiplies it, that is the square of 4, 16, by the square of 10, the number of completeness in the Bible. 10 times 10 times 4 times 4. Got that? Right. I'm not sure I do either. The judgment of God, portrayed ideally as taking place outside the holy city, extends to all men everywhere who find themselves beyond the pale of divine protection. So Mounce goes further in the literal application of some of these aspects. Again, the land of Palestine is brought in, the length of the land. That can't be an accident. So in the next segment, we'll deal with that more. Also with John Walvoord. Now, Walvoord is the source for much of Al Lindsay's viewpoints in the late great planet Earth. Walvoord was the president of Dallas Seminary, so we'll get to his viewpoints, which were long before established, but not nearly on the scale that they are now, because through TV evangelists, the viewpoints of Lindsay and other prophetic speculators have become the official interpretation of Revelation for hundreds of millions of people. Okay. But we'll leave that for the next segment.